So now that the first part of my Natchez Trace Parkway journey is over, I wanted to do a best of video of the best stops along the first 300 miles of the trace. Also give you some information that I found out on some of the stops after the fact and some personal opinions about each stop and why I really like them more than others. So let's get started. So this was the Elizabeth Female Academy ruins. The significance of this place was it was the first college, if you will, for females in the United States. It opened in the early 1800s. And another significant fact of it, this is one of the few actual standing relics along the trace of a building that's not been altered or anything like that. If you started the trip of the Natchez Trace from Natchez, this was the first section of the Sunken Trace that a lot of people saw. It was right across the street from an information booth, and it was very easily accessible. So it was a very popular place to get a good look at the Sunken Trace. As you can see here, how tall the walls were of how far the trace is sunken in the ground. And this right here was the Emerald Mound. It was actually the second largest Indian mound in the United States. Now, little did I know, off to the left of the parking lot was a pathway that had stairs on it that you could actually go on top of it and see more of the mound and that sort of thing. So I didn't realize that till after I left and kind of, wish I would have gone back and gone and seen it. This was another one of my favorite stops. Just outside of a visitor center where you could talk to a park ranger was Mount Locust. Mount Locust was a stand, or what we would call today a hotel, a motel, an Airbnb, that sort of thing. It's a place where people could stop at, get a hot meal, get some rest along their journey along the trace. Now, if I'm not mistaken, at one point there was upwards of 50 of these places on the trace from Nashville to Natchez. And one of the cool things of this one, you could go up the stairs to the back of the house and actually go inside the house and see the recreations of how things were back then. They had the tools, the beds, the fireplace, that sort of thing. That was pretty cool stop just to see how people lived back in the day and how simplistic their life was back then. Now, behind Mount Locust, through a little trail for the woods, lies the Mount Locust Slave Cemetery. In the cemetery, there is at least 10 known slaves, possibly more, but here's a list of the ones that are known to be buried here. One of the interesting things about this cemetery is this is the only gravestone that's left out of all the 10 known slaves that are buried here. Now, a little ways down the trace, there is another section of Sunken Trace. And if you see here, it's actually two parts where it's a Y in the trail. Now, the only reason I can think of why there is two sunken traces here, I'm guessing that the one section was at times impassable, so they made kind of a detour. Now, this is probably one of the most beautiful sections of the Sunken Trace that I went on throughout my whole entire trip. It is also pretty deep, as you can see here. Now, if you see them coming up on these two trees that are jutting out from the side, that was a very, very picturesque sight to see. It was just really interesting and probably my favorite Sunken Trace piece on the trail. Now, this cemetery here was from the early 1800s. It was in an area called Grindstone Ford, and what that area was, once you pass a certain point, that's where, quote, civilization ended, and that's where the Indian Territory began. Now, right past that was a place where you could walk down the original Natchez Trace Trail, as you can see here, and it's still sunken. Now, towards the end of the trail here, I found this interesting piece of concrete work that I didn't know what it was for, and I still haven't found out what it was for. It was at least a quarter mile down the trail and maybe a quarter and a half mile away from the Natchez Trace Parkway. I thought it was for maybe like a bridge crossing or a barge landing. I don't know. I still haven't found out what it's for, but it's just weird how this was out here kind of in the middle of the woods. About a half-hour detour off the trace is the ghost town of Rodney, Mississippi, and this Presbyterian church. One of the cool things that happened at this church, there was a little Civil War battle that happened and ended up leaving a cannonball stuck in the wall of the church. Now, on my way back to the trace after that detour, I came across the Windsor ruins. It was a early 1800s plantation home that was about 17,000 square feet and had up to 25 rooms, and it burnt down in a tragic accident, and the only thing left was these columns and these stairs. This is the Fort Pierre Presbyterian Church that was located about 2 miles off the trace just outside of Port Gibson. It was built in the early 1800s, and originally I thought it was the original church minus a new roof, but I later found out that it was actually a recreation that was done back in the 60s or 70s. This is the Owens Creek Waterfall. It's located maybe 100 feet at the most away from the Natchez Trace Parkway, and one of the very few waterfalls that you can see in Mississippi that's actually worth searching out. I actually climbed down to the bottom of where the creek come out and sat there and enjoyed it for a little bit. It was very interesting to see a waterfall in Mississippi of this caliber. The first night I stayed in my tent was at the Rocky Springs campground. It's a free primitive campground, first come first serve type thing. Very bare bones, but nice place to stay at for free. The next morning I got up and went into the ghost town of Rocky Springs where this Methodist church still stays, and according to the sign they still have services one Sunday a month, which was pretty interesting. And across the road from the Methodist church was the ruins of the ghost town of Rocky Springs. Now, for different reasons, the town dried up. Boll weevils, yellow fever, poor soil management, that sort of thing. And the town just withered away next to nothing. And the only thing that's left is a couple safes, cisterns, and this church, obviously. So it was kind of interesting to see the old ghost town and how it is now. And you can see how the ground is all ate up from poor soil management. That led to the town's demise. Now, this section of the Natchez Trace Trail was located just north of Jackson, Mississippi. And one of the significant things about this one is, as you can tell, the trace is not as sunken as it was when you were closer to Natchez and closer to the Mississippi River. So it's kind of interesting. You can see as further you get away from the Mississippi River, the less sunken the trace becomes. These were the Boyd site mounds. Interesting thing about this one was it originally was two mounds, but they filled in the gap between the two and made one oblong mound. I'm not sure why they did that. Maybe they were trying to conserve space or trying a different method of burial. I don't know. It was just interesting. Now, one thing about the sites, the names of the sites is usually the owner's name of the property of where the mounds were found. And that was kind of interesting to see how two mounds became one. This is one of the Cypress Swamps that you can see on the side of the trace. It was located about a half hour or so north of Jackson. What this was a dead river of the Pearl River, where the soil and everything had built up around and just made a swamp, basically a pond on the outskirts of the Pearl River. Now, there was boardwalks and hiking trails around the swamp, and it was a pretty interesting little stop to see. Usually when you think of swamps and everything, you think of Louisiana, but there's plenty of swamps in Mississippi if you know what you're looking for. This is the Coles Creek Swamp. This is another one of those dead river swamps that we see just on the outskirts of the trace. This one is not as fancy as the one we've seen previously, but it still kind of gives you an idea of what a dead river swamp looks like. This is a little bit muddier and not as popular as the one before. The walking trails are not as good and not as maintained, let's just say, but still it's pretty interesting to go hike around it for a little bit and just kind of check things out, see some wildlife, that sort of thing. The second night of my trip, I stayed at the Jeff Busby campgrounds. This is more than just a campground, as there is a picnic area, restrooms, hiking trails. There's a big overlook on top of the little mountain where you can overlook low-lying areas along the trace in the area. This campground was very similar to the other one, as it was free, no power, no water, very primitive, first come, first serve. But this one's a lot more popular than the Rocky Springs campground. So if you want to stay here, you might want to get an early shot at it, I guess you will. There's a little more to do in this area, and it's a little bit nicer park, a little bit more well-maintained, more things to do. Now, my first stop that next morning was this section of the old Natchez Trace Trail. Here you can really see how flat the trace is getting as it's getting further and further away from the Mississippi River. This is one of the first sections you can walk on that's predominantly flat. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see. These are what's called the Bynum Mounds. It was probably about this point on my journey where I started to realize some of these mounds are 1,000 to 2,000 years old. Now, I wonder what size they were back then, because you figure in 1,000 to 2,000 years of erosion, this is what caused it. This is the end result. So I'm wondering if these mounds were larger back then, or did they keep their shape? So either way, This is kind of interesting because it's two burial mounds, and just you can walk right up to them, little sidewalk. So nothing spectacular, but it's pretty cool seeing Indian mounds this close, I guess you'd say. The witch dance stop along the trace was one of those areas that I was really looking forward to seeing. According to legend, the witches in the day would come here and do all their seances and spells and all that other good stuff, and where they touched the ground, it scorched the earth, and the grass never grew again. The Indians stayed away from the area, and even one of the generals of the Civil War noted in his diaries of the scorched earth patches. So I was really looking forward to coming out here, and I was expecting to see scorched earth patches here and there. But the bad thing was, there was no markings for it. There was no maps telling you where to go. Nothing but about 15 miles of hiking trails off through the woods here, and I didn't have time to spend 15 miles worth of hiking to find them. So I'm going to do a little more research and see if I can find out where they are. And when I come back up here next time, I'm going to find those scorched earth marks. This is the Owl Creek Archaeological Site, about 3 miles off the trace. This is one of the most coolest disappointments I had along the trace. This was two Indian mounds. I want to say one was a burial mound and one was a structural mound. Now there was 3 others across the street on private property which we couldn't get to. But nevertheless, you could climb the steps over there on one of the structural mounds. The disappointment was Mississippi State did all this work, putting up the signs and doing some archaeological digs and information and other stuff, and the state hasn't kept it up. Mississippi State hasn't kept it up. As you can see, the walking paths are nasty, overgrown, trees are falling down. It was a very disappointment to see such a piece of history like this in this shape. But it was cool to see and cool to climb the steps and go on top of the mound and everything. But like I said, it was kind of a disappointment that it's not been upkept. If you're looking for a lot of information on the Natchez Trace, come here to the Visitor Center that's just outside of Tupelo. There's lots of informational boards, movies, dioramas, artifacts, books, movies. There's all kinds of things in here. I wish I would have spent more time in here, but I was kind of on a crunch for time. You could easily spend a half hour to 45 minutes, even an hour in here, just looking and reading and enjoying the history of the trace from past to present day. Just an interesting stop, but like I said, I was kind of on a crunch for time and kind of kicked myself in the pants for not staying here as long as I did. About 200 yards off the Natchez Trace Parkway, down this section of the original Natchez Trace Trail, was a Confederate graveyard of 13 unknown Confederate soldiers. Nobody knows what happened to the original gravestones, but in the 20s or 30s, the state replaced them, and then they got stolen. And in the 60s or 70s, the National Park Service came in and replaced them with the ones that are here today. It was just interesting that usually when you think of a Confederate graveyard or a Army graveyard or a military graveyard, you think massive amounts. But back in the day, this is probably where they just ended up being, and this is where these 13 soldiers are laying. I just thought it was interesting that this 13 of them just right here on the side of the Trace Trail. These are what's called the Pharr Mounds, and I think they misspelled it, and it should be F-A-R, because in this 90-acre area, the mounds are 200 yards is probably the closest one to you, and the other ones are a good ways off as well. Now there's 8 mounds out here, the smallest being like 2 feet, and you barely even notice it, and you probably can't even tell in the picture even where it's at. I think the tallest one is about 16 feet tall. Just kind of interesting how they were just randomly placed out here, but it was kind of odd that you couldn't get close to them. I don't know, it's just kind of odd, but it was just interesting seeing the mounds from a distance instead of up close like the rest of ones we had seen previously. Now I ended this part of the journey up the Natchez Trace Parkway here at Tishomingo State Park, which worked out quite well because the parkway was closed right past the park. They were doing some road repairs, that sort of thing. Now, I've been wanting to come to this park for quite a while, and I'm kicking myself in the pants for not coming up here sooner. This is probably one of the nicest state parks that Mississippi has to offer that I've seen. The lake was beautiful, the camping was beautiful, the park was clean, the trails were clean, the people were nice. It was just overall a really, really good experience. Now, the Natchez Trace actually splits this park in the middle, let's just say. You have the northern side and the southern side. The northern side has the lake and the camping and that sort of thing. Now on the southern side of the trace is where the hiking trails, the waterfalls, there's even a recreation of a log cabin out here. Now, I'm from the south part of Mississippi, so now I'm here in the very northeastern part of the state, and I'm looking at big rock formations and things like that. Now, some people say these rock formations are the start of the Appalachian Mountains. Some argue that it's not. I'm not sure. I was impressed by the rock formations immensely. I wish I could have spent more time here and spent my whole weekend here, but I only had an overnight and a little bit during the next day. There is probably, I want to say there's like 15 miles of hiking trails in and around the southern side of the trace. It's just a beautiful park. There's a big swinging bridge, or a creek that runs through the park. Like I said, there's miles of hiking trails that kind of figure eight and loop around themselves, and just interesting rock formations and natural springs, and it's just quite interesting. Just a very interesting park to me. I really enjoyed my time here. Wish I could have spent more time here, but I didn't. So we're definitely going to come back up here in the next couple of years and spend a good 3-4 day weekend up here, just enjoying Mother Nature and what the park has to offer. Now, this trip wasn't all just fun. There was some hard things that I really didn't care too much to do. One of the first things I didn't care a whole lot to do was to leave my family at the house. Usually they were right along with me, doing my little adventures and things like that. But I didn't want to bore them and come across a bunch of boring stops that are just wasting time and that sort of thing. So my plan was to go and see all the stops, pick out the best ones, and then later on we would make the trip and just catch the high points along the trace. One of the other things that I didn't like doing was actually leaving the trace. I really enjoyed my time just getting out there on the road, getting out there into the woods, seeing the history, doing some hiking, seeing some waterfalls, just this thing that I don't get to see here around the house. It was quite an interesting trip. Now, probably in the end of August, I'm going to try to get back up there and start again at the Tishomingo State Park whenever the rest of the trace opens up. So I might spend another day or two here at Tishomingo State Park, which would be nice to do a little more exploring. There's some things I didn't get to see that I want to try to see. So that's going to be towards the end of the year. I'm going to get back up there. You know, leaving that and knowing that there's more to see, that was kind of hard to do. But I didn't have the time. I had to get back to the house. I was, waiting, eager to see the family. Had to get back to work the next day. So, there were some ups and downs of the trip, but overall, I really, really enjoyed myself, and I'm looking forward to the last half of it, I guess you will. Last 200 miles, last 100 miles of it, actually. Tishomingo is 2/3 the way through the park, or through the traceway, I guess you'd say. But overall, I really enjoyed my time, and I enjoyed documenting and learning the history of each stop, and whether it was good, bad, or ugly. I really had a good time. But anyways, I appreciate y'all watching my best of the Natchez Trace journey. This is the first half of it, so I appreciate y'all watching. We'll see you next time.